return to the top of the hour. So I'll begin the presentation. And before I start, I'd just like to welcome you all to the presentation today, and also extend the invitation to come and visit Ireland for the World Potato Congress from the 30th of May to the 2nd of June. And if I could also just thank the sponsors of the World Potato Congress who have made these webinars and the Congress possible. So the title of my talk today is Potato Variety Development in Ireland, Historical Perspectives and Future Challenges. And we have a rich history of potato in Ireland. And the story that I'll start today, I'll start just after the famine period and bring it back up to modern day potato breeding in Ireland. I won't spend as much time on late blight. My colleague Stephen Kildea will be given the next seminar in this series, and I'll let him talk more about some of the practical aspects of control of late blight, but I'll refer to it in the context of potato breeding today. So you can see from this graph that the area of potatoes in Ireland has declined considerably over the last 175 years. It was over 800,000 hectares of potato grown prior to 1845. And this data is taken from the Central Statistics Office in Ireland, which began collating records in 1848. So you can see that there was a dramatic drop in the area grown from 800,000 hectares to just under 200 or just over 250,000 hectares in 1848. And it climbed slightly back up to the 1860s, up to a maximum of about 370,000 hectares before a slow decline up to the current to the current period. And a large part of this decline was the drop in the population of Ireland over that period through emigration, and also there was a large drop at the time of famine in 1845 to 1847. There was also a lot of potatoes used over that period for livestock feed, which practice declined over the last 100 years. You can see there are two spikes in the graph, and both of these spikes in potato production in Ireland relate specifically to the First World War and the Second World War. And the spike for the Second World War is much more significant. And there was a long period of rationing in Ireland, which followed on after the wartime period, where potatoes were unavailable. The current area of potatoes grown in Ireland is about 9,000 hectares, but a lot of the production now is very, very concentrated in a number of small growers, very specialized growers, and a very modern production system. If we go back to some of the earliest developments in potato breeding, this comes from the Farmer's Gazette, which was the periodical of the time, which was published in Dublin at the time of the famine. And there's a number of excerpts here. The ones on the left here are from 1845. And it just outlines the sale of some seed potatoes in Ireland at the time. This was 40 tons of the variety cups, which were for sale. They were available for inspection in Dublin, and they were being sold at the price of £4.10 a ton, delivered in Dublin or in Sallins, which was transported by canal. This is from October 13th, 1845, just at the start of the famine, and probably before the full extent of the losses of potatoes would be known. But this is a market price from Dundalk at the time for two varieties: cups for 2 shillings a hundredweight, and lumpers for 1 shilling and 4 cents a hundredweight, to a range of 1 shilling and 6 cents a hundredweight. So there was a clear preference for the variety cups at that particular time. Lumper, which was the variety which was most widely grown, was known to be quite low in dry matter and tasteless by comparison. This was one of the most interesting things that we found in the Farmer's Gazette from that period. And it's an article which was titled Regeneration of the Potato. It's actually from the Small Adverts. And it's an advertisement for true potato seed, saved in the most careful manner from the berry of the earliest and best kinds without disease. And there were 2 packets available, one containing 13,000 seeds and one containing 6,000 seeds. And it was to apply to Baltinglass, which is a town quite close to where I'm based at the moment in Carlow, for the packet. And there was also a sample of seed to be seen at the office of the paper in the centre of Dublin. So it would strike me that this is probably the first mention in Ireland of the use of true potato seed. And given the interest in true potato seed at the moment, for hybrid breeding and for cultivation of potato. It's amazing to believe that 175 years ago, at the time of the famine in Ireland, there was a sale of true potato seed. It's not known whether this sale, whether it was for the selection of varieties from it or purely for the propagation of potatoes. The next noted potato breeding program in Ireland was that of Thomas Carroll, who was the director of the Albert Agricultural College in Glasnevin in Dublin, which is now part of Dublin City University. And in 1885, when he took over control of that centre, he undertook a large programme of late blight control and did a lot of work on the use of Bordeaux mixture and early fungicides and the use of copper for late blight control. But he also began a large breeding programme with the goals of selecting for late blight research. It was probably one of the first examples of participatory plant breeding that I can come across, because the seedlings were actually sent to the primary schools in Ireland for selection and grown in the school gardens and selected by the schoolmasters and the children and exposed to natural blight infection in the schoolyards. There was a large number of varieties from this program displayed in the RDS in 1885. And the RDS is actually the site where the World Potato Congress will be held this year. So for those who are coming, it'll be a little bit of a look back on history. By pure chance, it turns out that Thomas Carroll, who was the director, this photo I got from his great-great-granddaughter, who happens to be a neighbour of mine, and it was only through chance that we found that out. Ireland was one of the first countries, I think, which had a seed potato certification programme. And Davidson, this book from 1938, is still consulted, was very, very comprehensive at the time in terms of the number of diseases in Ireland, and also gave a great description of the varieties that were present at the time. So this is the lumper that I mentioned earlier that was present at the time of the famine, and it was very dominant up until that time, but fell out of favour very quickly due to its susceptibility to late blight. The programme from the Albert College didn't produce a large number of varieties which were widely adopted. And the next variety which became widely adopted in Ireland was the variety Champion. And this was partly because it had very good resistance to late blight at the time. And the variety was very popular up until the 1930s and 1940s in Ireland. But began to be replaced by varieties like Kerr's Pink, British Queen at the time. So a number of varieties which were of particular interest of historical interest. This booklet was published by the Department of Agriculture in 2008 for the International Year of the Potato, and it's available online for anyone who's any interest in that. This is another plate from Davidson's book describing varieties of the time. And there was also other breeding programs in the country, particularly in Northern Ireland. And John Clark was a prolific breeder of varieties, all of which carried the Ulster prefix. With the exception of 3, which were done drawed and done loose. But it's interesting to see when you compare this variety, Ulster Monarch, to the previous varieties, Lumper, that you can see there's been very significant genetic progress made over the 100 years. And, you know, this variety, Ulster Monarch, it wouldn't look out of display in a modern potato breeding program. There was also a very large potato breeding program in the north of Ireland, which was run by AFBI, the Agri-Food and Biosciences Institute in Loughgall, where Paul Watts was the breeder. And it was in operation until very recently, where it served the potato trade in Northern Ireland, particularly the seed export trade, but it closed in the last number of years. So some of the varieties that came from that were Purple Majesty, which I think is quite popular in North America and been used for crisp production over there, Sunset, Milagro, Rich Hill, and Sparkle. This is just some data from Board Bia, who conduct national potato digs in Ireland. And Board Bia is the agency which promote horticultural produce and potatoes within Ireland. But in 1985, they undertook potato digs, test digs throughout the country to estimate the yield and also the amount of potatoes that would be present in the country. So this is some of the data from that. So it shows again that there was a continual decline in the area of potatoes in the country to about just over 9,000 hectares in the last number of years. But the interesting thing is that the yield of potatoes has continued to rise over that period. And one of the most interesting things from this, I think, is that we can see from 1985 to about 1998, there was a small increase from about 20 tonnes per hectare to 30 tonnes per hectare. And this was associated with a time of large consolidation in the Irish potato industry, where a lot of smaller growers left the industry. There was a lot of investment in storage and in new machinery, grading equipment, and consolidation amongst growers. And there was a lot of storage built through both European and Irish national grants at that time. So a lot of consolidation and modernisation within the industry. There's also a considerable yield increase from this period on, from about 30 tonnes per hectare up to about 45 tonnes per hectare in the last number of years. And a lot of this, I think, is associated with the release of the variety Rooster, which was released in 1991, and very, very quickly became the most popular variety in the island. It occupies about 70% of the total area of potatoes grown in the country. And it's about 25% higher yielding than some of the existing varieties like Kerr's Pink. And that movement towards a higher yielding variety, combined with consolidation and, I suppose, expertise within growers, has contributed to this shift in yield over the intervening period. So while the area of potatoes has fallen in the country by almost a third, the output is still 2/3 of what it was in 1985. There are two specific drops in this graph, and I'll speak a little bit about these later. But by pure chance, they both happened to fall in years that the World Potato Congress was held in the past. This one in 2012, there was a drop in the production of potatoes in Ireland. And for anyone who was at the WPC in Scotland that year, you may remember that it was a very, very wet spring and that crops hadn't been planted on time, and there was still a lot of planting taking place until June. And 2018 was the year that the Potato Congress was in Peru. But in Western Europe, that was probably one of the worst droughts on record. And that drop in potato yield is particularly associated with that drought period. And this is just an example of the current breakdown of varieties grown in Ireland at the moment. So Rooster makes up between 60 and 62% of the retail sales at retail level. Golden Wonder is a small part of the market at about 1.6. Whites, a range of whites, make up about 20% of the market. And then Kerr's Pink, which was the biggest variety in the country at one stage, has fallen significantly to less than 6% of the total area. And British Queens, if they're available in May in Ireland, are probably one of the nicest tasting varieties we have, are an early variety which are available from usually the end of May, late June until early October, are a second early variety and a traditional Irish variety, and a real treat if they're available if you're here. So this is just a little bit about Rooster, and as I said, it was released in 1991. It was bred here in Teagasc in Oak Park and marketed by IPM Potato Group, who are our partners on the breeding programme. And I think it's a very good example of a locally bred, locally adapted variety. It's been very, very stable over the years and had a considerably higher yield performance. Very good disease resistance, particularly to the Irish climate. High dry matter, which is a preference for varieties in Ireland. Roosters generally about 22 to 24% dry matter. But in comparison to the old incumbent varieties, it had a very, very smooth shape and was useful in a large range of culinary areas. So it was suitable for boiling, baking, mashing, very good for French fries at home. And so it just ticked a lot of boxes that way. And I think, as well as I mentioned, that there was a lot of investment in storage in Ireland at that time. Rooster came along at a time when that storage was coming online. It's a variety with very, very good storage attributes, and it's available now in the country. The crop can be stored for 13 months. So the potato breeding programme, which I work with, is based in Teagasc in Oak Park, and it began in 1962. It was set up by Harry Keogh, who was shortly joined afterwards by Leslie Dowley, who was the pathologist on the programme until recently. And it was initially set up to breed varieties for the Irish market. But very, very quickly, a partnership was formed with IPM Potato Group, who were one of the largest exporters of seed potatoes from Ireland at the time, to breed varieties for global markets. And that has been a global focus since. And that partnership continues to this day and was just recently renewed. So that partnership, the potato breeding program is self-financing and runs on a commercial basis on that side. We also undertake a lot of public good research, as Teagasc is the organization, semi-state organization, which has responsibility for agricultural research, development and education within the country. So Cara was probably the first variety which was released from the breeding program, which was successful, and it was particularly successful in the UK, Spain and the Canary Islands, where it's been marketed for many, many years. And I think it really set the basis under the potato breeding program here, and created a market for development and an income stream. Over the years, obviously the number of varieties, over 45 varieties have been released, and IPM have a very large base globally. So while most of the breeding takes place in Ireland, there's production bases in Scotland, Ireland, the Netherlands, France, recently Kenya, Brazil, and there's all of the green dots here mark export markets which are reached with seed from these countries. There's a number of licensees also in North America, the US, Chile, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. Okay. So just in the context of today's talk, I said that I would give a historical perspective and also set some of the challenges what face us as in terms of a breeding program with a commercial focus going forwards. So I've just highlighted some of what I think the big challenges in the future will be. So climate change is one which is definitely going to have an impact, both climate and weather events. And I think particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, slow changes in weather will probably be easier for growers to deal with. It's extreme weather events, such as what we've seen in 2012 and 2018, that will cause the biggest problems. Some of the other issues will be endemic, emerging and migrating pests and diseases. And one of the things that I think is quite important is, late blight is always a huge problem. This is an example of a trial in Ireland in 2009. And the difference here between the first picture and the second picture is 2 weeks. So you can see in an unsprayed late blight trial, the ferocity that late blight can still exhibit in unsprayed potato crops and the threat that it poses to production. One of the things that we've noticed very significantly in years where planting is delayed, and weather obviously influences the disease very, very significantly, but in years where planting is delayed and we have late emerging plants in June, when conditions are perfect for late blight, and into July, it can cause very, very serious problems with late blight that are much more difficult to deal with than in previous years. I think one of the other issues that we're going to have to deal with these with more severe weather events will be drought, obviously, things like secondary growth in potatoes, producing varieties which are resilient to that, and potentially also, I think, earlier maturing varieties that have good tolerance to drought resistance, which is a tall order, particularly to try and avoid later harvests. I think policy is going to create a large number of challenges for us as well. The EU Green Deal, in particular in Europe, pledges that we will have 25% of EU agriculture organic by 2030, a 50% reduction in pesticides, and a 20% reduction in fertilizers. And for a crop like potato, which commercially at the moment relies very heavily on fertilizers and fungicides in particular, this will pose a lot of challenges. And I think another challenge is diversifying markets, adaptation to both current and changing agroecologies and local practice, and also adapting to consumer and industry preferences, which are changing, because breeders at the moment are breeding a variety that's really only going to become popular in 10 to 15 years' time. So it's important to be future looking to see what we have to address, both in terms of growers' needs and consumers' needs in the future. This is just an example of what our potato breeding program looks like. We usually produce 200 to 300 pair crosses each year between different varieties. It's a conventional breeding program, and a field-based selection program over the next number of years, reducing the number of varieties each year until effectively at year 6 we're down to 70 varieties, at year 7 potentially 20 varieties, and after 12 years of selection new varieties are released. In the past, the program was based very heavily on phenotypic selection at the early stages. In the last number of years, we've developed a system of marker-aided selection, which is applied at the year 4 stage to our seedlings for a range of pests and diseases. And this gives us much more information in terms of the level of disease resistance that is present in our varieties and in our seedlings for selection. And I think this is one of the ways in which we're addressing the need to challenge for a reduction in pesticides and more sustainable varieties in that way. And what we hope to do, or what we have done and hope to do, continue to do with our marker-aided selection program in the future, is to select for multi-disease resistant varieties with stacked resistances to a range of pests and diseases. Another very important part of our potato breeding program, I think, is the ability to trial our varieties in a range of markets that allow us to select for varieties with good adaptation to a range of markets. Because we breed for a global market, it's very important to determine and to be able to test how varieties perform in these climates. And one of the things which I'll touch on lately is not just to test our existing varieties, but also to try and breed predictively for those markets. And I'll mention a little bit about how we hope to do that. So this is what our current trials program look like. We have trials in the Canary Islands and in Spain with PEP, in Morocco here with Marasem, in Israel, in France, the UK, and the Netherlands and Ireland. And I'll mention some other developments around that further in the presentation. So this is just one of the strategies that we've used for stacking resistance genes in the program. And in the past, if we produced a new variety, it would take 12 years to produce a variety, and it would usually be that length of time before breeders would use a variety as a parent in the crossing program again. What we've done is we've tried to use parents which have a large number of resistance genes. And for examples here, we've just picked the H1 resistance gene to Glabidera rostokiensis, 2 resistance genes, GPA4 and 5, to Glabidera pallida, a lake blight resistance gene and a virus gene. And we tried to combine those in the crossing program to come up with multi-trait parents. In the past, as I said, it would have been 12 years before we selected varieties. Now, when we perform marker-aided selection at our year 4 stage and have some field-based data, we can select parents very efficiently which have the traits that we want and return them to the start of our breeding program, which is reducing the recurrency of selection and improving our ability to select for varieties with stacked resistance. One of the other things which is quite important to us as well is the decrease in time that it has taken to develop markers for use in our breeding program. 10, 15 years ago, it took 4 to 5 years to develop a single target or a single market. Now it's possible to do that where information is known in a much shorter period of time, sometimes as little as 4 to 5 months with the amount of genome data that's currently available. This is just an example of the benefits of using marker-aided selection for stacking QTLs. And Glabidera pallida, or PCN, is a potato-cyst nematode for which no single gene confers complete resistance. And a number of years ago, we created populations which combine 2 resistance genes, one from Solanum andigena, GPA4, and one from Solanum vernii, GPA5. And we looked at a selection of genotypes from within those populations, 25 in each case, which had no resistance genes, both resistance genes individually and 2 resistance genes together. And we tested them against populations of 5 populations of Glabidera pallida to look at the effect on the reduction of cysts to determine the resistance of those populations. And we were very pleased to find that where we combined GPA4 and GPA5, this gave us almost complete resistance to Glabidera pallida in a range of populations: Lindley, Lough Ness, Farset, Newton, and Cheverny. So it proves the utility of this strategy, not just in breeding for PCN resistance, but also in terms of breeding for late blight resistance, where stacking resistance genes in the future, I think, will contribute to the stability and the long-term use of those resistance genes. And this is just an example of a variety which has come from that program, which is the variety Buster. And using that strategy, we were able to combine 5 resistance genes, 2 Glabidera pallida, 4 to Glabidera pallida, and 1 to H1 resistance gene to Glabidera rostockiensis. But the interesting thing about this is that the time period between crossings in the early stages, from 1979 to 1985, there was 1 cross from 1984 and 1994. But when we identified seedlings within our program which had the requisite genes, we were able to perform 3 rounds of crossing within 6 years to give this crossing, which the variety Buster was selected from. And with this selection of resistance genes, you can see here 6374/23 is the seedling code. It's extremely resistant to Glabidera pallida. So just to move off maybe the disease resistance and to move on to understanding our market, growing practice in agroecology present and future, and the adaptation of varieties, and maybe to try and relate that a little bit to potato growth in Ireland. You can see here, this is how rainfall falls in Ireland. We have a very dry, not dry by European standards, but dry by Irish standards, piece over in the east of the country where most of the potato production takes place. And a study conducted in 2002 by Holden and Sweeney hypothesized that or showed that the effect of climate change would have a significant impact on the ability to produce potato in the east of Ireland, particularly in this traditional region. More recently, we have reviewed 60 years of potato research in Ireland. This paper has just gone online in the last day or two, so it reviews a lot and has a lot of the information that's present in this talk, but also talks about some of the future challenges of pests and diseases and how climate change may affect potato in Ireland in the future. But one thing is clear, I think, to us, is that one of the best ways is to look for varieties which have resilient traits, both to pests and diseases, but also to adapted to local environments with good drought tolerance, early maturity. And the only way to do that is really by extensive trialing and developing information around these varieties and trying to predict how we can select for varieties like that in our breeding program in the future. And given, I suppose, the scope of our program, that it works over such a wide geographical space, it allows us to select varieties which will be resilient to climate change in the future. And that's something, I think, an activity which we need to intensify in the future. This is just an example of some work that was done on the variety Electra, which is a variety that's about 10 years old. But when it was released from our breeding program, it's about 15 years old. It had always performed very well in our trial series. This is a site in Morocco, in south of Spain, Morocco, north of Spain, and the Canary Islands. It had always performed very well at these sites. And this AMI analysis shows the performance of Electra in terms of its yield stability. So varieties which have a point very, very close to the line here are very, very stable across sites. Varieties which have a point which is very far away from the line are unstable across sites. And yield is plotted on the x-axis here. So Electra was always the highest yielding and most stable variety in our program. And when the variety was released, this became apparent as well, that it could be grown in Northern Europe, North America, South Africa, South America, Equatorial Africa, and it seemed to perform very, very well at all of these sites. So it was very, very neutral to agroecologies and to climate. This is an example of Electra being grown in Eritrea, where it's become the #1 variety there. It was introduced through IPM and Vita, an NGO working there in conjunction with the National Agricultural Research in Eritrea, and it performs very well there. So one of our goals has always been to try and find how can we predictively breed varieties with this level of adaptation. More recently, IPM Potato Group have set up a joint venture in Kenya to produce seeds locally there and market them locally. and it's based on local seed production. And we had done some work there in the past, and I suppose it asked the question, how can we contribute to producing varieties that are more adapted under Kenyan conditions and indeed under sub-Saharan conditions for a market that we're going to be actively involved in the future. And that led to a PhD project. And this is Thomas Kwambai, the PhD student who's supervised under the crop systems analysis program in Wageningen with Paul Strike. And his PhD program was to understand potato production practices and grower variety needs through surveys and discussion, but also to explore variety characteristics that contribute to adaptation by trialing a diverse panel of European and SIP and local varieties at 3 different altitudes in Kenya, typical of where potato production takes place, and to try and understand the effect of genotype and environment on dormancy and interaction with local systems. And this is something that became very important in the early part of the PhD because of the bimodal production system of potatoes in Africa, where dormancy is very important to be able to break dormancy in a variety to allow it to be used as seed in the next production season. And currently, this project is just at an end. The last season trials finished last September, and that data is being evaluated and will be published under the showing the agronomic data and the relationships with variety characteristics. But the dormancy work is being prepared for publication at the moment, and it showed some very, very interesting results. So seed was taken from potatoes that were grown at 3 different altitudes. Over 50 varieties were grown in the trial. It was done over 2 seasons and 2 years. And we evaluated the performance at the 3 different sites and also across the seasons. And the interesting thing to note here is that there's a huge diversity or difference in the dormancy of varieties that are grown there and that have been introduced to Kenya, from over 60 days or under 60 days here to varieties which don't break dormancy for over 140 days in some cases. And I think it's very important to understand this in the context of entering new markets like that, to target varieties with correct dormancy or to exploit the different levels of dormancy within a market, maybe for storage or to target early planting. And this is just an example from a field in Ethiopia of a farmer who has planted a crop that hadn't broken dormancy. And there's huge problems there with seed rotting, potentially late emergence, and differences in maturity of the crop and problems with emergence as well. In the context of looking at the differences between seasons, what we found was that dormancy was affected much more at lower seasons or at lower elevations than at higher elevations. So at Kalro-Kitale, which is the lowest site, there was a marked difference in the dormancy mean of the varieties of about 10 days. And I think this is very, very useful information for growers, but also for breeders in terms of targeting varieties for that market in the future. So that's almost the end of the talk, and it's just to bring some of those ideas together to give an idea of the current directions of travel within our program at the moment. And there are a number of projects which we're involved with within Chagasquin and IPM along 3 themes: genotype, adaptation and resilience, trait discovery and genotyping, and new breeding techniques. And many of these projects, there'll be posters on them at the World Potato Congress, and potentially 1 or 2 may be available for talks as well. And I'd just like to thank everybody who has been involved in some of these projects over the last number of years, but particularly Dan Milburn, who's my co-principal investigator on these projects and has been my partner in crime on potatoes for the last 20 years and is the leader of many of those projects, which I've shown in the last slide. And on behalf of everyone, I'd like to thank you for your attendance today on behalf of the World Potato Congress, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. So the first question that I see, which I can't answer, but I know that it's quite high, is what is the consumption of potatoes per inhabitant? I can tell you that the national production in Ireland is about 380,000 tonnes per annum, and it varies a little bit up and down on that depending on the production year, but generally about in that region. In breeding for storability, what characteristics do you look for? I suppose one of the big issues we have encountered is in terms of breeding for the processing market, where resistance to low temperature sweetening and good storability of potatoes, which will process out of store 12 months after going into store, is a big goal. And particularly in the last number of years, in terms of the loss of CIPC, and it's becoming more important to try and find varieties which are sustainable, which can process without large quantities of sprout suppressants. So that's what we're looking for, I suppose, in a range of dormancies there. Longer dormancy varieties for processing varieties, where the ability to reduce storage temperatures are not as to protect processing ability is more important. There's a question here. The United States and the Netherlands have already heavily invested in diploid breeding. Are potato breeding programs in Ireland planning on moving towards a diploid breeding system? There's a half answer to that question. We're involved in two particular programs at the moment. One is the FixRes program, which is fixation restitution breeding with the plant breeding department in Wageningen, and a number of other companies who are involved in that, and another project, Diffugat. And the idea behind that program is to produce diploid parents which produce 2N pollen and can be used in tetraploid crosses, but will be good donors of stacked resistances within that. So that is part of the trajectory for the breeding program here in Ireland at the moment, but as yet no plans for full hybrid breeding or true potato seed. So one from Peter van der Zag. Have you used the variety Shangi with very short dormancy in your breeding program? No, and that is one of my goals in the future, will be to bring more of the Solanum andigenum material, if possible, for use in breeding programs, because I believe there's an awful lot of adaptation in those varieties that can be exploited in Western or Northern Hemisphere potato breeding programs, particularly for global markets. But it's very difficult to get that material into Europe at the moment, but it is an aim in the future. So one question here, does the market I work in prefer high dry matter potatoes? Is it possible to work to share potato germplasm? Please send us an email. We're always happy to collaborate. Just to mention as well, one of the projects which I mentioned here, and I didn't go into too much detail on them. We have a project just starting at the moment on resistance to common scab with Herman van Eck in Wageningen, and we have a PhD student who's just started on that, and we're looking for information on varieties with resistance to common scab. So anybody who'd care to share some information on that, we'd be very happy to receive it. Does the market that we work in prefer high dry matter varieties? Yes, definitely in Ireland that has been the case. It's probably changing a little bit now. Many of the white varieties that I mentioned earlier tend to be slightly lower dry matter, and younger people tend to prefer maybe a slightly less dry potato, but in general I would say yes, Ireland is still firmly a high dry matter potato market. How much seed is produced in Ireland for the EU? So there's two questions which came in on this. One was from a a colleague in IPM, and the other one is also from How Much Seed from North America. The level of seed production in Ireland has been very, very small over the last 10 to 15 years, partly due, I think, to the success of Rooster, which supplies most of the local market, but tends, because of the high dry matter, to sell at a slightly higher price than ware potatoes in the EU or in the UK. So a lot of the seed production in Ireland has been done for native Irish production, and there has also been imports of seed from predominantly Scotland, which has been badly affected by Brexit at the moment, because it's no longer possible for seed to enter Ireland, and that will cause some problems in the shorter term. I believe it's possible that seed production may increase in Ireland, but the economics have to stack up. Certainly the capability is there to do it, the land is there to do it, and the technical expertise is there to do it. In the last number of years, potato growers in Ireland tend to rely very heavily on rented land, and we've had a lot of dairy expansion in the country over the last number of years, and very inflated prices for land, and land being locked up on long-term deals. So the more profitable potato crops are the ones that take precedence. So if the economics stack up, there is certainly the possibility for increased export of Irish potatoes to the EU. One question here: have we managed to breed out susceptibility to internal rust spot? It's a very good question. I think we've a lot more understanding around about internal rust spot and internal diseases than we had in the past. I think one of the key things is there are no genetic markers available for it, but I think breeders have a very good understanding now as to which varieties give heritability for internal defects, and tend to avoid using those varieties. And I think one of the key things here is to trial varieties for as long as possible in as many and as wide a number of sites, and particularly sites which are known to cause internal problems, to try and weed out varieties with that at an early stage. And the idea of the level of performance regarding the EU target of 25%, 50% and 20% for organic pesticides and fertilizers, how are these targets affecting yield? It remains to be seen. The Green Deal, to the best of my knowledge, doesn't specify that the 25% will have to be in particular areas. There's a huge interest in organic potatoes, I think, at the moment, and there's a large number of late blight resistant varieties coming to the market at the moment. My fear for a lot of varieties in this space is the need to have stacked resistances for the sustainability of those varieties. And also, I think that hybrid models where some level of pesticide can be used or fungicide can be used to sustain the resistance would be important in the future. With fertilizers, it's not quite as clear, because there's an awful lot of variation within potato varieties for response and nitrogen use efficiency. And in a lot of cases, if fertilizer is reduced, switching to varieties, which is not always easy, with better nitrogen use efficiencies may help. In terms of the 50% reduction in pesticides by 2030, potato is a particularly heavy user of fungicides, I suppose. But a lot of the older actives, like mancozeb in particular, have high active ingredient rates per hectare. So elimination of some of the higher, heavier or higher active ingredient rates may go a long way towards reducing that level as well. Are there emerging diseases that we're targeting in our breeding program? A lot of the emerging diseases that are potentially of a problem in Ireland, or could become a problem in Ireland in the future, are not ones which resistances are particularly available for. I think two diseases which are very, very close to us in continental Europe, or two diseases and pests, would be Ralstonia and Colorado beetle, which have never established in Ireland. but potentially could under different climate scenarios. I think one of the diseases which we were very interested in doing some work on would be Undecaya and blackleg, but the number of resistances and the heritability of those resistances is quite difficult to incorporate in breeding programs. Are there issues with potato mop top and tobacco rattle virus in Ireland? I suppose in land which has been heavily propagated with potatoes and had poor rotations in the past, where powdery scab is present, there can be issues with mop top, but I think many growers are well aware of which fields those are, and we don't see it terribly often. It can be a problem in certain fields. Tobacco rattle virus, we don't tend to see that much. So are growers receptive of the Green Deal, and do they feel it is possible to achieve without potential adverse impacts on supply? I think potato growers are very, very resilient. As a group, they have to be. There's not many groups like farmers who will plant a crop without knowing what the price will be in the future, without knowing what the weather will be in the future. And I think they're very open to innovation and change. I think all growers are a little bit trepidatious about or concerned about the effects that some of these things will have, but I've no doubt that the industry will come to a way to find its way around these things and adopt new practices in the future. So I think that's it from the questions. I don't know if there's any more, or if Nora in the background might have any more questions. Okay, so once again, if I could just take a moment to thank the sponsors of the WPC and the WPC for organizing this conference today, this webinar today. And I think we can end there if there's no other questions.